Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we head into a big week here with the NBA draft just days away. Do we expect any moves to be made by the Bucks? That remains to be seen, but a lot to get into here in this offseason. It begins this week, and we're joined by Fayaz of Brew Hoop to dig through all of it, what we could potentially see by the Bucks here, and more importantly, a thorough explanation on the second apron and why the Bucks are desperately trying to get out of that. We get into that conversation coming up next year on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down, the sports start sporting. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That is right, something for everybody all day, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. It is the week of the NBA draft. We know the Bucks hold a pretty high pick in the second round and the 23rd pick in the first round. What happens with that pick? We've already talked about quite a bit here these last couple of weeks. We will get into some thoughts on that first round pick and the implications of either keeping it or trading it. But to help us pour through all of that and basically a second offseason primer here, the managing editor of brewhoop.com, Fayaz. And Van, as we were getting set up here, we were talking through some of these second apron things. And I mentioned, too, you beat Frank to the punch on the explanation of, look, the Bucks are locked in to the second apron for this season that ends 8 days, something like that from now on the 30th of June before the new league year begins. Their second apron team for that year. There are some ways to get out of the second apron for this upcoming season. We will get into all of that and a lot to touch on with that first round draft pick. But first and foremost, thank you for joining us on the show today. And I mentioned too, we were going to do basically, and I don't want to talk down to the audience, but a second apron for dummies of, look, we've told you it's bad. Here's the reasons why it is bad. I guess before we pour it over all the details and what you could see happening, let's just start with the easiest thing possible. Do you think the Bucks are going to be a second apron team next year as well?
It's hard to handicap those odds, but I do think they are going to look to get under it because it's really the only way they can meaningfully, I think, reshape the middle of the roster, because otherwise they're just going to be limited to what they were limited to last season, which is the veterans minimum and, second round, first round draft picks. They have one this year, but yeah, I think that there is a way under it. And based on some of the things we've seen come out, especially in the last few days, I think they are looking actually to get under it. And that will reduce their payroll. But I think more importantly, and I think that's not their motivation. I think their motivation is making these cost-cutting moves to gain the flexibility that you get from being beneath the second apron. Because I don't think it's an issue of the Bucks or the ownership not being willing to spend. It's just these are the rules now. And you have to, if you're the Bucks, you have to make a cost-cutting move in order to gain access to a lot of the better tools you can use to add players to this roster.
Camille, before you jump in here, I guess the way to look at it is it's kind of like, especially the first credit card you had in college where you're right up against your max. You submit that payment of, all right, I'm going to make this payment and it gives me X amount of dollars to spend. You spend it and then the bill comes and you're over your maximum because of the taxes or the interest rate, I should say, and everything else. That's basically the spot the Bucks and all these other teams are in. Of we can find ways to get under the second apron right now that'll open up the taxpayer mid-level and some other things for us. And then next year, we're right back there, and it may be even more tough to avoid.
Yeah, it definitely could be. And you mentioned Justin too when we started, just saying like, don't want to talk down to the audience. I say it often, like explain the salary cap to me like I'm 5 years old, because one, it's brand new with all of these new rules that they have with the second apron, with the first apron. So some of just getting used to the terminology and getting used to a new CBA. So we keep mentioning the fact, that the Bucks are a second apron team. Ben, could you take the time to and just talk about the difference between the first apron and the second apron team, and like what the Bucks might be trying to do and why they're trying to shed the salary, like, and what ways are they handicapped with building the roster out with them being a second apron team?
Sure. So the first apron that's been around for a while, and it used to be the only apron. You might recall that in the championship season, the Bucks were hard capped. Yeah. There was some talk about that, and that meant they were hard capped at what is now the first apron. Back then it was the only apron. And the reason that happened is because I believe it was triggered by signing Bobby Portis to the biannual exception. That's one of the things that can trigger a hard cap. They may have had some other move that I'm forgetting, but regardless, that's a number you can't cross. When it's the league salary cap, we call it a soft cap, because you can go over it by, you could be like the Warriors and the Suns and go over it by tens of millions of dollars and pay all the associated penalties, as long as you're not hard capped. But so that's why it's a soft cap. But if you do a few things, you're hard capped. Now, as far as what you can and can't do, what's happening now with the first apron is actually pretty similar to what the Bucks dealt with in 2020. The restrictions are the same. Like if you acquire a player via sign and trade, like if the Bucks were to try to sign a free agent and then send out some players to make it work with their cap sheet, you're hard capped at the first apron. Using any part of that biannual exception, which, if you're way over the first apron, like the Bucks, you don't have access to anyway. And then also the classic, the mid-level exception, which this coming year is going to be around a little bit under $13 million. If you use any more than what's called the taxpayer portion of the mid-level exception, which is $5.2 million, you get hard capped at the first apron. So that's basically to say, like, every team that's under the second apron has access to the mid-level exception. The more you're under, if you're under the first apron, if you're under the tax, then you I shouldn't say the first apron. You have to be under the tax level, which the Bucks are not. Then you can spend up to $13 million. That's how the Knicks were able to acquire Dante DiVincenzo last offseason for signing him. But if you spend more than that percentage of it, whatever it is, in for this year, it's going to be $5.2 million. A couple of years ago, Joe Ingles was the signing. He got the taxpayer portion of the mid-level, which was like $6.4 million, I think, at that time. If you go beyond that $5.2 million, you're hard capped at if you go past that, you're hard capped at the first apron. And there are a few other restrictions to the first apron. I guess maybe the most notable one for that is taking back more than 110% of the salary you're sending out in a trade. So you could add a little bit of salary as long as it's less than 10% more. Now, that's all stuff that will happen if you're, closing out on the first apron. If you do any of that stuff, you're hard capped at the first apron. You cannot spend any more than that in the upcoming league year. The first apron this year, I'm looking, it's about $178.7 million. Now, I'll tie this in with the Bucks a little bit. Right now, the Bucks for 2024, 2025, if all of these salary numbers, I want to preface with a couple caveats, I guess 3 caveats. One, we'll talk about this, is that they're keeping their first round pick next week. And the associated slot value of that is about $2.9 million. It's 120% of the rookie slot value. That's the hold they have, the salary cap hold. So that number is included. Also, fully guaranteeing AJ Green for next year. He is non-guaranteed for next year until I think it's July 7th. So they've got to make a decision whether or not to keep him. I think it's pretty clear they're going to keep him. So his full salary next year guaranteed, a part of these numbers I'm going to say. And the last one is Andre Jackson Jr., who is also, he's got a partial guarantee for next year. But that decision isn't due until the league-wide date, which is in January. So technically, he's only got about $945,000 guaranteed right now. But for the purposes of this, let's assume that he gets that full guarantee when the time comes. That's going to put the Bucks' salary, like the total team salary, at $185.8 million, way over the first apron. But we're closing in on the second apron now, right? The second apron is $189.5 million. So stay with me here. At the second apron, here are the new restrictions that were instituted with the 2023 NBA collective bargaining agreement. And some of these took place, some of these took hold last summer, but a few of them were worked in more gradually. But as of July 1st, all of this is going to be in effect. So as we might remember from last year, one of the things that will hard cap you at the second apron. So let's say you've got what the Bucks have, the salary approaching 189.5. If you use any portion of the mid-level exception, like forget about 5.2 million. If you use even $1 million of that, you're hard capped at that apron. Sending out cash as part of a trade, that's actually somewhat important. The Bucks have done that in recent years. They did it last year. They sent out cash on draft night to get a second round pick that became Andre Jackson Jr. I believe, or was that? I think it was him. And I don't think they traded a future second round pick for him. I forget. But regardless, the Bucks have done that many times. They've bought a second round pick.
I mean, the Warriors basically pioneered it early in their run, where they were the team of, fine, we'll just buy draft picks, and that's how we'll start to accumulate some young players.
Exactly. And then the final one, which is the one that I think, this is a newer one that wasn't a part of calculations in the trade machines last offseason and whatever anyone was trying to figure out as far as getting players to certain teams, is if you're over the second apron, as the Bucks are, you cannot aggregate two players' salaries in a trade. And what that means is you can't trade out more than one player. You can trade one player and get multiple players back. That's permissible. But the Bucks cannot put two players together in a trade if they're over that second apron. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But before I go on, I think it's important to note a couple things. One, you might be saying, hey, Van, that's under the second apron, right? $189.5 million is under this, is the second apron, and they're like almost $4 million under that. That's true. However, the second apron does include unlikely contract benefits, which means that last season, the only player on the Bucks who had some of that language in his contract was Chris Middleton. He needed to play 65 games to get to that benefit, to hit that bonus. Of course, he did not. So the Bucks aren't paying it. However, just because they're not paying it, and just because that salary would have that benefit pushed them over the second apron for last year, and doesn't matter. It does not matter. All of those, and I actually found where it says this in the CBA, because a few of us cap sickos were trying to figure out how exactly this worked. But as of the last day of the regular season, the day after, whatever your salary was, including all unlikely benefits, that's your number for the second apron. The Bucks were over that. The league does not figure out what bonuses are hit and ones that aren't until June 30th. So the Bucks were a second apron team immediately after the regular season ended, regardless of any benefits. Next year, they also are facing these unlikely benefits with Chris Middleton. So that bumps their salary up from their team salary is $185.8 million, right? You add in those benefits and you've got $188 million. You're closing in on it. But here's the caveat with all this. That salary I just mentioned is for just 11 players. And one of them is a first-round pick. So there's only 10 of those guys actually on the team. You have to field a roster of 14 teams. So in these situations, you have a cap hold, an incomplete roster charge, they call it, which is equal to what a veteran's minimum contract is, about $2 million. That fills up your roster or your cap sheet basically to 14 players. And it makes it so you're in compliance with this rule, even if you don't have these players. So functionally, while all of the penalties they have towards the second apron are under the second apron by like about 1.5 million bucks, that's for just a few players. That's short a few players, I should say. So they need to fill out their roster, and in order to do that with that money, they would be limited to just minimum contracts. And if they fill out to 14 with that salary, with minimum contracts, they'll be over the second apron for next year, and they'll face all the penalties I just said. I hope that wasn't too convoluted for anybody.
Passion, drive, and patience. That is the formula for winning championships, and it is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.
But I think that is a pretty good synopsis of their situation right now.
The bonus piece was the important part, because I think we even talked about it on this show towards the end of the season. For any cap related stuff, what I typically reference is Nate Duncans spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. So when you go back to that and you see, well, wait a minute, I'm seeing, granted, there's no wiggle room, but they're just narrowly under it. So that's the explanation of all these things that we've explained of it doesn't matter with the league. It's basically saying, no, that number, that's the number. If you, I know it's not the Bucks just deciding we're not going to pay this, but if the guy doesn't hit it, I mean, great, you personally saved some money, but your team does not. So that's the explanation on which I think a lot of our listeners and audience had the question of, I thought I had heard they had avoided the second apron because Chris Middleton didn't get those bonuses. Half of that is true. He did not hit those bonuses, but it still counts against that apron. So that's the good explanation there. And I think even more important is the last piece that we talked through is not only the Bucks' current cap situation and where they are projected to be, but that number that you gave of 11 too. Look, you still got to add 3 more guys to this roster. And that's where things start to become very, very interesting. When I've talked to a number of people that I typically do throughout the course of a season, and it did seem like early on in the offseason, the consensus that I heard from people was, I don't know how much change we're really going to see. Like, this team behind the scenes really believes that it was a weird year. We had all these things that we were up against. Camille and I, we've talked about it. You guys have talked about it at Brew Hoop as well, with Dame coming over when he did and everything that Dame and Doc Rivers talked about. But that, to me, I'm not saying this means the Bucks are going to trade Brook Lopez and Pat Connaughton and Bobby Portis, but that, to me, signals the most reason to get behind. I don't think this is going to be as simple as just essentially run it back, and we think year 2 of Doc and building out that coaching staff is the path that the Bucks are going to be headed down. You mentioned,
totally agree. I totally agree.
And because you have no choice, really. It's, I mean, look, they could just say, fine, that's what we're going to do. We're going to keep this core together. We know we got one more run, but it's the realization of everything that we've talked about. You guys have talked about as well for years now. You got to get younger and more athletic on the perimeter. You got to add a ball handler. You got to add a playmaker. You're doing it with 3 veterans minimums, essentially, and maybe a second-round pick that you've really found some value in. And that's just not sustainable. So I think we all agree that's kind of where they're headed. Is one of the names that you hear oft mentioned here is going to be moved. So I suppose we'll transition to that with a conversation here. A couple of names have started to trickle out within the last handful of days here. Earlier on Sunday over the weekend, we saw a report of, hey, the Bucks are looking into move Pat Connaughton to shed some salary cap. We saw late last week, I think it was Kevin O'Connor of The Ringer that was the first to have the Bucks want to play a little bit more versatile, and they're looking into shopping Brook Lopez. I forget who it was, but there was a show I was listening to on Friday, one of the national shows, and it may have been Nate Duncan's show, and they were talking about that exact situation of, from what I heard, the Rockets told Brook Lopez, part of it was a hard sell of, we really want Brook Lopez, but part of their deal was, look, if you sign this deal with the Bucks, they are probably going to trade you after a year because you are a tradable contract. If it doesn't work out, you're who they would have to lean on to make any wholesale changes. And with us, we're telling you, you're taking the word of Tillman Fertitta, but we're telling you, you're here for 2 years or however long it is. We're not going to trade you. We want you here to help build this. So that name has come up. Not quite as concrete. I think it was just kicked around very briefly. We even heard Chris Middleton's name come up in the sense of the Bucks are literally looking at everything. So I guess let's start there with all three of us. We'll start with you, Van. Of all those names, or maybe there's somebody that I did not list. We didn't mention Bobby Portis, but anybody else in the roster, who do you think is the most likely to not be on the Bucks next season?
Well, I think the most likely player who's not going to be on the Bucks next season, who we haven't talked about, is Malik Beasley, because there was also a report from Chris Haynes,
that
on Friday that he's likely to go. He's going to get offers up to that non-taxpayer mid-level. But that's beside the point. We're talking about players that could be traded. I think, the big three names, obviously, going into the offseason, Brook Lopez, Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton. I want to give you a few numbers here. So if the Bucks wanted to avoid the second apron for next year, they're going to have to cut about $4.7 million. That would just get them to the second apron. So at least 4.7, because what I was saying earlier, if, with the salary you have for the 11 players, including the 23rd pick, the unlikely benefits for Middleton, and then veteran minimum contracts to fill out the roster, you're going to be over the second apron by about $4.7 million. Now, if they want to cut that money, the only way really to do it is by trading, because all of their contracts, with the exception of those ones I mentioned, AJ Green and Andre Jackson Jr. are guaranteed. But even if you were to waive them, that would not get you beneath the second apron. So if they want to do that, they're going to have to trade and get some guaranteed salary out the door and take back less in, because, as I mentioned earlier, they cannot. I think I mentioned this. Maybe I didn't. When you're over the first apron, or when you're coming in on the second apron, you cannot take back more salary than what you send out. So if you're trading Brook Lopez, he makes $23 million next year. You can't take back more than that. Pat Connaughton, 9.4. Can't take back more than that. Bobby Portis, 12.6. Can't take back more than that. It can be multiple players again, but it cannot be more than that. So if they, to get under the apron and gain some access to like the mid-level exception, for example, or just allow themselves to maybe get some veterans rather than like second round picks, if they're just trying to get right under the second apron and not actually have any room below it, they would need to cut about $5.9 million. So almost $6. We'll say $6 million. They can do that in a number of ways. They can trade Brook Lopez, they can trade Bobby Portis, they can trade Pat Connaughton, but only one of them at a time. If they trade one of them and they got on their second apron, then they could package some more players together. And then they could add Marjon Beauchamp. They could add AJ Green or someone like that. But they have to get below. They have to make that cost-cutting move first. Now, the report from this morning from Evan Sidery, I think it was, talking about Pat Connaughton. He put it as they're looking to acquire a more versatile role player, I think, is the language he used. Now, I think that might be a little challenging with Connaughton, particularly. He has 2 years left on his deal, essentially. He's got a player option for not this coming year, but the following year, which worth the same.
He's picking that.
Yeah,
sure.
Totally. And $9.4 million, same salary as this season. So he's got like a 2-year, $18 million contract, essentially. That contract, I don't think has positive value right now. I think if you wanted to trade that for basically anything, certainly if you wanted to salary dump it, you're going to have to attach a draft asset to it. I would hope not the first round pick. I don't think it's nearly quite that underwater of a contract, but maybe the 33rd pick from this year, or maybe one of the, I think there's only one future second they're gaining access to in 2031 or 2032 in the coming weeks. But to get under that, if you can trade Connaughton and not take more than, let's see, it's about 3.4 million, 3.5 million in return, then you have a lot more flexibility to operate within the confines of the second apron this offseason. And that includes signing a player with the entire value of the taxpayer mid-level, $5.2 million, while also being able to have room for some vet minimums or rookie minimums if you cut at least $5.9 million. So I think Connaughton, that's maybe the easiest route to go in terms of like a basketball sense, because I think they're pretty. They have some prospects on the wing that they'll want to continue giving minutes to. Of course, I'm a big Ajax fan, and I like AJ Green too. I'd like to see them having more roles next year. If Connaughton is shipped out, it's probably not going to affect the on-court product too much, or just team production too much. But you're not likely to get much in return. It might just be you're getting salary relief, and you may have to, like I said, attach a second-round pick to it. So if you're looking to then trade Bobby Portis or Brook Lopez, well, easier to send one of those guys out and acquire, $5-6 million less than you're giving up, and then getting that flexibility I'm talking about. So I think probably Connaughton's the most likely guy, and we've seen the rumors right now. And I think, if it were me, I would look to trade Bobby Portis before Brook Lopez. I'm a believer in Brook Lopez. I think
we all are.
Yeah. It's from an on-court fit. It's going to be very hard this offseason to find, like, on the free agent market, pretty much impossible to find even like a rotation level center. There's just not much this offseason. Sure, maybe in the trade market, but I would think if they were going to trade Lopez, as they've talked about, they would look to acquire, a big man in return. And there are names I like in that context too. So I would sooner trade Bobby Portis, just because I think his role is something that they could fill from within to an extent, but also they could address with some external moves, like, trades we're talking about, but maybe in the free agent market too. They may even be able to get some of that production from like maybe not a 5, someone who can play the 4 and the 5, but someone who can play the 4 and shoot the 3 a bit and give you some of that scoring that you're losing. I think they might be able to figure that out if they sent out Portis.
I love that you
bringing back Danilo Gallinari. Are we saying?
Sorry, Gallinari. He's about to. He's getting ready to play with Team Italy in the qualifiers. So maybe he's a little too busy to deal with contract negotiations.
No, Van, I love that you brought up order of operations, because framing it in that way of saying, like, well, hey, if the Bucks do make this move, for example, trading that Pat Connaughton somewhere else, you're just trying to get that salary relief and what they can do after that. I think talking about that flexibility is really important for the Bucks, because, we said it earlier on in the show, which I think is an important part. It's not necessarily about teams being cheap at this point of trying to get under that second apron, but you are so handicapped with how you build out your roster that it might not be worth being over that second apron. And I think back to what Pat Riley was saying when the Miami Heat got put out the playoffs. And he mentioned the fact, like, there were 8 teams that pay luxury tax this season. Only 2 of them got past the first round. The other 6 were all at home after the
one
first
didn't
round.
even make the playoffs. The Warriors didn't even make the playoffs, and they paid more than anybody.
Exactly. So it's like, it's just trying to find a way to be able to have a team where you can put something together that makes sense. And with the Bucks talking about wanting more flexibility in their defensive scheme, so on and so forth, I have to say, I agree with you and Justin wholeheartedly about how difficult it will be to replace Brook Lopez. I understand that he's, older, 36 years old. I understand that the Bucks need to be looking for a center of the future. But when you think about his fit on court with the Bucks and what he provides with his ability to space the floor at the 5 position, his ability to have the rim protection, it's like, I don't know who on the open market can do what Brook Lopez does, both things that he does well, even just one of those things really. And it's like, I know the Bucks could use their first round draft pick to get somebody. Then the question is, do you really trust an early 20-something-year-old guy to anchor a championship defense? Like, that's a lot to put on the plate of a young player really early on. So
Derek Lively was a real exception to that rule, wasn't he?
Yeah. And now everybody, of course, wants to find the next Derek Lively because you saw it and you're like, hey, if we could find a rookie that can contribute, we'd be on point. But of course, everybody feels that same way as well.
That's a very far end of the bell curve outcome for a rookie.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And looking at the open market, as you mentioned, Camille, boy, the list of like centers right now, Mo Bamba, very popular name among Bucks fans for years, but very polarizing name, I'll just say. Goga Batadze, Andre Drummond, Nick Claxton is someone who's going to get probably the full mid-level, not in the Bucks price range. Then you've got Drew Eubanks, Hartenstein, another guy.
Hartenstein is just going to get blown out of the water.
No way.
With what he's paid. Yeah.
No way. Damian Jones, DeAndre Jordan, Alex Len, Luke Cornett, Mike Muscala, Mason Plumlee, Daniel Tice. You're not going to get, I don't think with any of those guys, you could not cobble together any sort of big man rotation that would get you what you would lose with Brook Lopez. And you have to factor in that's going to put Giannis at the 5 a lot. And he's been, pretty clear about how he does not want to be doing that long term. And, I don't want to be the guy to explain that to him. Like, hey, we're trading Brook Lopez. We know you love playing with him. And we want you to be the full-time starting center right now. Sound good, buddy? Like, I don't want to have that conversation.
Yeah.
I don't think it'd go very well. So yeah, big man, that's a tough one. I do think maybe it's addressable via the trade market, but also tricky.
I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't looking like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
Have you seen any trades that you like for Brook Lopez? I've seen a few floated out there. Like, I saw one with the Rockets for Steven Adams and Tari Easton as a suggestion. I saw one reaching out to the Orlando Magic.
Was that my suggestion? I put that out there like 2 months ago, right after the playoffs. Because Tari Easton is a guy I really like.
Yeah, Tari Easton's the part I like. The Steven Adams fit is a little bit more like that doesn't seem like it fits perfectly for me. I also saw one for Wendell Carter Jr. and Lopez.
That's the name I was going to mention.
To Orlando. But are there any other trade options that you do like for Brook?
Well, those were the 2 names I was going to mention. I think with Adams specifically, like he's coming off a very major knee injury. Mm-hmm. He's, I think, 31. He may have something left in the tank. He's only got 1 year left on the contract. Yeah. Obviously, he wouldn't replace the outside shooting from Lopez, but I think he certainly is an elite rebounder and a good enough rim protector that I think that would be a decent stopgap solution. And if it got you Tari Eason, who is someone I really like, I think that'd be worth it. But he also has some injury concerns. He missed most of last season with an injury. I'm glad you brought up Wendell Carter Jr. because he's probably I would say the closest guy to to Lopez out there that you can find on the trade market. He's developed a 3-point shot. I think he was up around 39% last year. He's a couple inches shorter than Lopez. I believe he's listed at 6'10", but they're listed about the same weight. He's, I think 6'10", 270 is what I saw when I was looking at him earlier. And he's young. He's I think 25 maybe. Yeah, I think that would be a great fit. And he's under a long-term contract through, well, I guess he's got 2 years left on it, but it's a declining value contract. And you look at Orlando, they've got two great forwards who are both best played at the 4, I would say. And Juan Banchero, who I think could be a credible center, at least offensively. And, you split that position up between him and Brook Lopez, I think it would fit. And Orlando has a lot of cap space this offseason too. So they could make this trade. It would slash about almost 12 million from the Bucks budget this offseason. But other names out there, these aren't necessarily, these are names for Brook Lopez that you just look at when you look at, you can find on Basketball Reference, you can sort every player for the upcoming year by their salary. So it's kind of easy to do. You just find Brook Lopez in the middle there, $23 million, and you just look at everyone below him. Yeah. Those are the guys you can get. Of course, there are names in there you won't be able to get. Like there's right underneath him, there's Jaden McDaniels, I should say, from Minnesota. Derek White, you're not going to be able to get those guys. But I think it was Kevin O'Connor in that Ringer article said the first person I've really heard say this, but they could trade him for Bruce Brown straight up. They both make the same $23 million for next year and are expiring. That doesn't save the Bucks any
cap space or
room under the
apron. It also doesn't explain why the Raptors would want to do it.
I know. I would think it would be part of like a bigger deal. Yeah. I think it would just be, Lopez send out somewhere. Brown would be the one coming back. Another name that you see kind of not really earnestly mentioned in trade rumors that is, I think, a decent fit for the Bucks. Kind of like, who is it? Just talking about Adams, how you don't have the outside shot, but you have kind of everything else you like in the center. Is Jared Allen, who I'm a big fan of personally. Yeah. He's making $20 million each of the next 2 seasons. Cleveland, again, I think this would be part of a larger trade. I don't think Cleveland has any need or interest in Brook Lopez, but
I'm glad you brought this one up.
Yeah,
because I was talking about this with somebody else too. I think the natural inclination is to say, well, it does make sense for Cleveland because they're getting out of Twin Towers.
Right.
But the way Brook plays is offensively is much different from Jared Allen that I think you could convince yourself.
Maybe it could work. Sure.
It's a better fit with Mobley and Brook Lopez offensively than it is
sure.
with Mobley and Jared Allen. I still...
Mobley's kind of like a younger Giannis, the similar skill sets.
Right. I think the difficulty, and I'm with you, I really like Jared Allen, but I think the challenges would be more for the Bucks than the Cavs with that because you would have
two non-shooters. It's tough. Mm-hmm. I've had this conversation too. I think it's a little bit less of a big deal to not surround Giannis with all these shooters like we've been used to in previous years because there's now this guy named Dame Lillard on the roster who teams are going to respect a lot more. Sure, yeah, when Chris is healthy. I think that maybe now with a healthy Chris and with Lillard on the roster, you can get away a little bit more with having Giannis and another non-shooter on the floor at the same time, as long as you're surrounding those two with some marksmen. But that's the tricky thing. There's not a lot of guys in this range, especially big men who have that shooting ability. A couple names I'm going to throw out also. This would be, again, like, I'm not saying any of these are like Brook Lopez for this guy straight up. No, just Brook Lopez is the outgoing salary from Milwaukee going somewhere, maybe going to this team, maybe not, But this is and then I'll talk about the player who's coming in. Big men, Zach Collins from San Antonio. Obviously, a lot of injury concerns, but has some skills that you like in that area. Isaiah Stewart from the Pistons. The Pistons have beef stew. Yeah, the Pistons have been a complete disaster the last few years. It's gotten just ridiculous with the firing of Monty Williams. So Trajan Langdon, their GM, is coming in right now. You don't know what kind of value he's going to place on the guys you already have. Stewart is, I mean, he's got a bit of a, we'll just say a little bit of a head on his shoulders, but he's young. And he's also developed a shot, a little bit undersized, you'd say, for a center, but certainly makes up for it with physical strength. Other names might be gettable. Again, this is kind of in the same categories as Jared Allen, Mitchell Robinson, Kelly Olynyk. Not a guy I like very much, but does make some sense. But then those are just big men. There are other guys in this range who I think if this was who you're getting back when sending out Brook Lopez, you might be excited about it, or at least you could live with it. Especially if maybe you got something else with him. Keldon Johnson from the Spurs, Colin Sexton from the Jazz, Harrison Barnes, Bogdan Bogdanovic would be hilarious from the Hawks, Karis LeVert, Dorian Finney-Smith, Luke Kennard, and then a little bit lower Cole Anthony, and a guy I really like from the Wizards, Denny Avdia. Yeah, these are all players who I think would fit in well with the Bucks, who are just in between the salaries of Brook Lopez and Bobby Portis.
I think Denny Avdia, not to get too sidetracked, seems like he's going to be the next Derek White type of teams, recognizing the development that they saw last year, especially, and let's go get him. I like a lot of those names that you brought up. I think the other one that you could really talk yourself into, if this makes a lot of sense for the other team, and it would shave some money for the Bucks. Granted, you'd be taking. I think I know who you're going to say. There's just no way possible to the trade. Is if you did a big man swap with the Phoenix Suns, but they're in an even worse spot than the Bucks are. That there is no way possible for them to send out. I think it's 18 or so million that Yusuf Nurkic is making, and I think there's 2 additional years on that deal.
Just one. I've got it right here.
But either way, an additional year. So the Suns would be taking on more money. They would have to cobble together, which is impossible.
That's not. They can't do that. They're also over the second apron.
Yeah. They're way beyond where the Bucks are.
They're even in worse shape than the Bucks. You mentioned, Camille, earlier how filling out player. You had talked about the Heat, but filling out your roster with minimum guys, like the Bucks did it a little bit last year. They signed. I guess it was just Robin Lopez, Malik Beasley, and Thanasis. You can count that, but the Suns had to sign 6 guys to minimum deals, and that just did not produce a quality team with enough depth to make it in the playoffs. So it's they're in a really bad place, Phoenix.
Yeah. And the other challenge to it, which is, I mean, the Bucks, I think they'd be feeling it a lot more if it weren't for what comes along with the second apron, is where you look at the Bucks cap situation and look at the contracts that have been doled out. I know others have talked about it, but I think as we get into this offseason, it really shines a light, and it's only going to get worse, that the mid-class is, if it's not dead, it is dying in the NBA. That's where all these teams are. You look at the Bucks that have put together the Dame and Giannis contract. You look at the spot that the Celtics are going to be in. You are seeing fewer and fewer of these deals that are, where the cap is headed at this point, even the $15 to $20 million contract range. But in the past, when we would think $9 to $15 million, that's your midpoint, there's fewer and fewer of those. We're seeing the max type deals and then rookie scale contracts and veterans minimums filling out rosters.
It's going like this. Yep. The upper class and the lower class, there's a parallel to be made to society there, but I won't touch that. But yeah, you're quite right. I noticed that last offseason, this middle class of salaries is going outward.
And it's only getting worse. The other interesting team I just don't know what, I mean, in terms of basketball, what the fit is for the Bucks to look for. And in terms of contracts, it makes sense. I just don't know what that team would do. Is we've heard this team name kicked around, the New Orleans Pelicans, and you can say, hey, get a rim protector, get a guy that can play 5 out alongside Zion and everyone else. That fit makes sense for the Pelicans. You look at the Pels roster, there's a lot of names that make sense for the Bucks. I would be stunned as much as Bucks fans want it, and I would love it too, if the Pelicans said, all right, you give us Brook Lopez and we'll give you Herb Jones. End of deal.
I feel like the Bucks have some assets there, like a lot of assets that they don't have to get Herb Jones over here.
That's not going to happen. I do think there are other names though that like would work. Larry Nance Jr. That's a guy who comes in, under Bobby Portis's
is an innings eater, basically.
Yeah, but a quality player. I think he's a free agent. But Najee Marshall,
we've talked pretty about good for them in the playoffs.
Yeah, he's probably. I was reading the other day someone who's going to be more towards that $5.2 million mid-level, which maybe the Bucks could get. There are a few guys out there who might fit with the Bucks if they can open up that cap room. But I don't think Herb Jones. It's a real pie in the sky right now. Brook Lopez for him straight up. I don't think that is something David Griffin will do.
All right, that'll do it for part 1 of this conversation with Van, but we got a lot more to get into. So we spoke for quite a bit. So part 2 comes your way on tomorrow's show. We get into a lot more in the player discussion, other names that are out there, what we could realistically see happen, not just this week, but into the offseason. That conversation continues on part 2 of the offseason primer here with Van from Brew Hoop. Look for that on your feed tomorrow morning. For Van, Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.